again, thank you, Raul. So we move on to the next session, is where we get to hear directly from one of New Zealand's leading importers and distributors of fresh produce. Jade Reeves, welcome. Jade is the imports manager with MG Marketing here in New Zealand. Procuring, sourcing fresh produce internationally falls under Jade's responsibility. He has worked for MG Marketing for over 21 years. Jade brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to the role, and we're extremely fortunate to have someone with a depth of knowledge and experience in key account management, warehousing, logistics, procurement, and supply, joining us on our Path to Market webinar today. He is also currently the chair of New Zealand Fresh Produce Importers Association. Today, MG Marketing is a cooperative representing over 400 grower stakeholders. Jay, today you are addressing growers, exporters of fresh produce from a number of Pacific Island countries. Maybe you already do business with some of them, who knows? Others online are from other manufacturing sectors, business owners, company directors, government officials, and the list goes on. Welcome, Jay, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Glenys, and thank you everyone for having me today. I'll just get the presentation up. Right, so today I'll be talking to you about who MG is and also where I see some of the opportunities for many of the Pacific countries to maybe provide some value to the New Zealand market and how to better access the market. I thought I'd start with a little bit of history about who MG Marketing is. We are a growers cooperative, and we started in 1923, so nearly 100 years ago, when there was a small group of growers in Wellington were looking for a better way to market their produce. So they formed MG Marketing. Today, we now consist of, as Glenys said, 400 shareholder growers, but we actually transact for about 700 growers, both in New Zealand and abroad. We sell an extensive range of fresh fruit and produce. We like to think we do everything from A to Z that's available, but I'm sure there's potentially many growers here that would have some options that would help us extend our range. Outside of our core fruit and produce wholesaling business, we also own or have involvement in several subsidiaries, including a business nearly identical to our own in Australia. We've got exporting businesses operating out of New Zealand, Australia, and the United States. We have New Zealand's largest flour wholesale and auction house, and we have several corporate growing operations here in New Zealand and in Australia. A couple of things about us, a few facts on what makes us different is, as I said before, we've been around 100 years, and many of our employees and many of our relationships are decades old, and we'd like to think that's a testament to the quality of service and professionalism that we provide those growers. We are New Zealand's largest supplier of fresh fruit and vegetables, and New Zealand's largest importer of fresh fruit and vegetables. We work with all the major retail and food service operations in New Zealand. And as I said before, we pride ourselves on our extensive range, and that's an area I hope you can, some here can help us with. We're across all areas of the supply chain. As I said before, we're vertically integrated right from growing, warehousing, sales, and distribution. Our national network, this is our footprint here in New Zealand. We have 9 physical locations. They provide warehousing and sales avenues for us throughout the entirety of New Zealand. It's one of our advantages. But outside of that, we also have 2 virtual branches, if you like. And what they do is they currently meet the needs of some of our larger chain customers, where they can access through us almost like a direct to DC platform, and that has changed quite a lot of our business and given us additional capacity to manage more stock. our global network, we're currently working with multiple growers across about 17 countries, and it spans a really extensive range. We're in all the mainstream commodities that you're probably aware of, things like bananas through Dole, grapes, citrus through the likes of Sunkist and some of our Australian partners, but we're also into some of the niche stuff too, like dragon fruit, mangosteen and lychee. A lot of the relationships we have been cultivated over many years, but at the same time, we're finding each year there is new opportunities to establish new relationships, and New Zealand's palette is changing. And with those changes, there is demand for a more diverse range of products. Some of the things that we really focus on, not only in our international programs, but also in our domestic programs, is we really want to bring quality products consistently to the market and adapt to the changing palette of the New Zealand consumer. So I really can't emphasize enough the need to focus on what would be commercially grown, good quality product. And if that can be achieved, then the sales opportunity in New Zealand is exponential. A couple of things that are important when thinking about entering the New Zealand market is around the need to meet some compliance and sustainability requirements. As with many global businesses, we have some requirements around food safety, worker care and sustainability. These are not a nice to have, they're a must for MG marketing, but they're not, in many instances, they're not only a must for us, they're also requirements of either the New Zealand government and or our customers that we supply. All our international suppliers to MG marketing, at the very least, and probably to most other importers of fresh produce, is we expect our suppliers to have at least one internationally recognised food safety quality assurance certification, something like HACCP, Global GAP. Those types of programs are really a necessity to enter the market here. Most of our customers require that we can provide evidence of that certification for the suppliers that we're providing them with. And something that will come to the fore in the coming years is the requirement also to show that not only are we meeting the food safety requirements around compliance, but also we're meeting the requirements around responsible sourcing, things around how the environment's being taken care of. And there's a lot of interest now in how workers are being valued and treated within the supply chain. Now to what I hope might be a bit of the stuff that's a little bit more relevant to establishing some business connections. The New Zealand customer base is made up primarily in produce of the major supermarket chains have a really large hold over the market. We work along with all the major supermarket banners from the Foodstuffs Group, New World Pack and Save, Foursquare, Gilmore's, the Raywood Freshers. We work with Progressive and Countdown, but also the Fresh Choice and Super Value Group. That's one segment of the market. Then there's another segment that has different requirements and needs around the variety of product, but also the quality of the product, which would be our food service providers. We work with all the major food service providers, also our local independent retailers and some of the smaller food service businesses in our regions. And we supply right down to the flea market and weekend markets here in New Zealand. So we really are across the whole spectrum of customers. Where I think that there's, in the presentation here, you'll see there's some commodities that are listed. I've gone through the New Zealand Import Health Standard to identify in the Pacific Islands some commodities where I think there is the low-hanging fruit where there is opportunity. Some of them are seasonal, like the limes, melons, eggplant, avocado, sugar pea, chili, and courgettes. And then some of them would enjoy a longer window, the likes of the mango, pawpaw, ginger, and taro. These commodities on this list many of them, some of them are already imported into New Zealand, but many of them aren't imported into New Zealand from the Pacific, yet there are import health standards for a lot of countries for them. And with the challenges around shipping, biosecurity management in some countries, these will become more relevant. And I do believe that with the global freighting issues, the Pacific Islands are becoming more a viable option for some of the supply. The real key around the supply is getting to a scale where it's viable to supply New Zealand, and also to compete on the international market. Things like ginger, in particular, taro, pumpkin, watermelon. The reason they work well out of places like Tonga and Fiji is because they're able to be loaded on as sea freight consignments. So they can compete against the likes of the Thailands, the Philippines of the world, where they also can produce vast quantities. Things like limes and mangoes, though, air freight is, and snow pea too, air freight is the only real viable option, but there is demand and capacity here in New Zealand to take more. And one of the things we are seeing is demand, particularly for mangoes, is growing exponentially as I mentioned before, as our consumer tastes change. When coming to the market, it's one thing to have the product. The next thing is to make sure that your country is able to export these products, but also that you are meeting the biosecurity requirements to have them cleared into New Zealand. Information around that, around MPI and what the clearance requirements are available through the Fresh Produce Import Health Standard. But I'd also suggest that you reach out to your local biosecurity bodies to check with them to understand what help they can provide in either gaining access or establishing contact with New Zealand to explore new access, as I know it is a key focus for the New Zealand government. We work with clearance agents here in New Zealand to help assist with things like assist with the customs clearances and MPI requirements. So you can also reach out to us here at MG Marketing, and we can provide assistance around that. It's once product has been shipped, it will arrive in New Zealand. It has to go through a transitional facility and then be inspected and cleared in New Zealand, as all fresh produce is considered to be of high risk, a high biosecurity risk for New Zealand. These are things that need to be considered when shipping to New Zealand, because we can't receive the goods until MPI have released them to us. Finally, I'd just like to touch on one of the things that Rohan mentioned to me is a lot of growers are interested in how payment and stuff is arranged in New Zealand. Here at MG Marketing, we have a range of arrangements depending on the relationship that we've had in the past, the level of comfort the grower has with us and the level of comfort we have with that grower. They can range from, we have many of our long-standing relationships the grower sends to us and we pay them in full 2 weeks after arrival. But in newer relationships or relationships where cash flow is important, we do have arrangements where deposits are paid on receival of a full set of documents, i.e. the invoice, phyto, QDEC and Seaway bill, and standard terms around deposits are usually 30 to 50% on receival of the docs and the balance 2 weeks after arrival. In terms of with the issues around freight, we find that the best scenario for us out of the Pacific is for the growers to provide CIF terms, as many of the growers already have shipping arrangements for other commodities coming to New Zealand. Where we can't get those, we will buy on FOB terms, and we work with the likes of GVI Logistics here in New Zealand to secure us freighting options for sea freight. They'll also help provide us with options for air freight. That concludes my presentation, Glenys. Thank you all for your time today, and if anyone's interested, I'm more than happy to share the presentation with Pacific Trade Invest to distribute amongst the attendees.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you very, very much, Jade. So much information packed in your presentation that we're kind of trying to keep on top of the questions that are coming through. So please stay with us for a couple of minutes. If you don't mind, I'd like to put a few questions to you, if that's okay, that's coming through.
No problem.
So the first one is around COVID. How is COVID changing the trade landscape for MG marketing?
It has provided numerous challenges. I run a team of about 7 or 8 people. Primarily, we'd say they were market traders. We actually spend most of our time working on logistics now. We have had to use, traditionally we did a lot of our large commodities as sea freight. We have had to start to utilise other avenues for bringing produce to New Zealand in terms of utilising the air freight options, which is also challenging as well, because as we have COVID outbreaks, the likes of in Australia, they start restricting the flights. We've also had to branch out and really look at where the commodities are grown that are approved for New Zealand, because we've had to reach out to other countries that we haven't traditionally worked with to bring product in to ensure continuity. And ensuring continuity has been very difficult. There was an article yesterday in the in most of the major newspapers about the price of grapes in New Zealand. That's purely a consequence of the freight and shipping delays in the west coast of the United States. So it has had a very big impact on our international programs.
Thank you, Jade. There's a question that's coming through on whether or not your company handles seafood.
No, we don't handle seafood. We're only fresh fruit and produce. We don't do frozen. It's all fresh.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you. Another question around you had a slide. If you wouldn't mind just pulling up the slide on the where you listed product. Yeah, that one. So just on this, in yesterday's presentation, MPI highlighted the fact that the Pacific Island countries have a whole list of approved, market access approved produce, and not all Pacific Island countries are exploiting that full list to the fullest and are only using a fraction of their approved commodities on their approved list. Some of the commodities approved on those lists include those listed here. What would be your message to Pacific Island countries? Could you just highlight, I know you touched on it in your presentation, but just to kind of reiterate, around the seasonal window, do you see, would you say this is a value proposition where Pacific Island countries should give serious consideration to the seasonal windows that present itself in New Zealand and factoring that into their business proposition, if you know what I mean? So it's just, if you could just talk a little bit about that seasonal window.
I think for many exporters in the fresh game, it very much is a thing where you have to factor in the seasonal windows. Even now, our largest trading partners, the likes of Australia and the United States, a lot of the commodities that they do are only for particular windows. You take courgettes, for example. Fruit fly is an issue for Australia. So we have a period which they term winter window where courgettes can be brought into New Zealand, and it's only limited to about 3 or 4 months. Limes, we've done lime programs for years out of the United States, and it really is an October through to mid-January program. So if there's growers if there's growers out there that are in some of the countries in the Pacific that have limes as an access point and have that top window, that could be a really valuable trade to them. And the Pacific countries that are supplying us now, the likes of Tonga don't supply us all year round with products. They supply us the products when they're out of season in New Zealand, but through establishing a good trading network and building the commercial consistency and quality over time, the programs are significant, where we're sea freighting many containers over a reasonable period of time. And we will work with the growers to, it's not that we want you to take all the risk, we will work with the growers to help with forecasting, planning, to make sure that the product that does arrive in New Zealand is able to be sold and sold for a profitable position.
Thank you, Jade. That's really, really useful. And I'm sure the listeners this morning, those registered online, will take your advice under consideration. I don't see coconuts listed there. Do you trade?
These are the ones. There's lots and lots of products already coming in. These are ones where I know that is the demand for these products far outstrips the supply. Things like coconuts and even taro to a degree, pumpkin, that they are all reasonably well catered for. There's still room for supply for sure. But so these ones here are the low-hanging fruit.
Yeah. So the likes of ginger and chilies, we don't, probably Pacific Island countries can't compete with what you currently have in the avocado range. But for things like ginger and chilies, what sorts of volumes are you talking about here? Just ballpark.
Well, it really does come down to how they're coming into the country. If they can compete with the value of some of the countries that are already, you've got China and Thailand, who are the big major suppliers who send sea freight containers of ginger. But with the sea freight rates out of Asia at the moment, it's closing the gap. There's nothing to say that New Zealand couldn't be importing multiple containers every month of ginger into New Zealand. That's quite conceivable if the price is competitive. I know we've had ginger in the past and still do have ginger coming in from Fiji, and the quality of the ginger grown is very good.
Okay. There's a question here on, can Jay please elaborate more on the varieties of taro and eggplants and the types of chilies?
I think the best.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Yeah, it's quite a different question. I know on the chilies, cayenne here is very popular as a mainstream chili, but then there's also chilies are a very niche product. So the ghost chilies, the bird's eye, all of it has a place in the market, and especially in the winter when New Zealand is obviously very cold and a lot of that production is grown in New Zealand in hothouse. There's a good opportunity to grow, especially the cayenne, for New Zealand. Eggplant is a little bit more difficult. Obviously the black varieties, like I think one of them called Black Beauty, I think is what's grown here. Although it's always very hard to know what the varieties are, as I'm not across the domestic, 100% across the domestic market. But you want to be growing comparable to the New Zealand market to meet the window, because with something like eggplant, you're looking to replace the missing product in the winter months in New Zealand. Taro, pink taro outstrips white for sale in New Zealand by 5 to 1 when we bring it in. There's still demand for white taro, but the pink taro really does have the consumer's eye.
Is a consumer preference, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Just one last question, Jay, if you don't mind. This is on certification. So you mentioned in your presentation how important it is for growers and exporters to consider or take into consideration or have the minimum certification, HACCP included or GAP, right?
Yes.
What's coming through, not only to Pacific Trade Invest, through our office, we're receiving this in feedback from our clients across the Pacific that with COVID and closed borders, it's become so hard. In fact, certification is almost impossible now with closed borders, where you have certified assessors unable to go in country to undertake those assessments to then carry through to for them to obtain their certification. So I just mentioned this, and I'd be interested to hear your comments, whether you've also heard this from your any discussions that you're having with would-be or new clients, either from the Pacific or elsewhere. Again, a COVID-related question.
I think it is, and it always, even before COVID, compliance for a lot of the smaller nations has been very difficult because the auditors are not based locally. When I've had discussions in the past, even with government bodies from various countries in the Pacific, I've always implored them to have a look at what they do in New Zealand here, where we've developed the New Zealand gap, so that New Zealand has its own accreditation that lines up for New Zealand retailers, because that mitigates some of the need for some of the global certifications. I haven't come across, obviously most of the countries we're dealing with are very large and are probably the borders outside of New Zealand, Australia and the Pacific have been a little bit more open, so they've been able to they've either got auditors there or been able to bring auditors in, because they don't have the very strict restrictions that we all have as we try to protect our people from COVID. I think it is something that would probably need to be addressed, and if we were establishing new relationships, we'd take into consideration if they'd already had accreditation that had lapsed because they can't bring auditors in. We'd take that into consideration, and we'd also take that to our customers that have these requirements for around compliance, to say, hey, we have this new supplier, they don't have the accreditation, but can we have an exemption because they've held the accreditation up until this point, and due to the border closures, they can't get the auditors in, but they will have the auditors in as soon as restrictions are eased. But I do think there's a couple of things that could help some of the people looking to trade into New Zealand. One's working with your government department to try and establish a good agricultural practice growing and food safety program in that country. That could be considered equivalent to what is in either New Zealand or Australia, but also working together as a lot for the smaller growers too, considering working as a cooperative to pool your resources so that the burden of some of the costs of compliance, because I know that's another consideration that we often hear about even here in New Zealand from our smaller suppliers, is the cost of compliance is very high. Finding ways to spread and share and mitigate that.
Yeah, that's so true. And it, as you said, it applies in New Zealand, and it also applies across many of the Pacific Island countries. Jay, I don't know how much time you can avail us this morning, but if you don't mind, I just have one more question for you, and that is around some of the challenges that you raised. If you, in your parting comments to the online listeners this morning, what would you list as 3 main challenges that Pacific Island countries exporters should address to allow for greater imports into New Zealand?
Logistics, globally, logistics is the biggest. In fact, possibly now it's an advantage for the Pacific, because the freight seems to still move reasonably freely. The providers there have done a good job, but logistics is the number one. You've got to be clear about how you're going to get your product. It's one thing to have the product, you've got to be able to get it to market. The other challenge is the compliance factor, not just the food safety compliance, but also making sure that when you're growing in a commercial fashion that aligns with the biosecurity requirements of New Zealand and meets the MPI requirements. So establishing early on what those are and working with the biosecurity bodies within your country would be ways to mitigate that. And the other one too is the scale. Like, it's fine to have a little bit, but having a volume that avails itself so that we can bring it in consistently, because there's nothing worse for the New Zealand consumer than giving them something and then saying, no, you can't have it for an extended period of time. Like that, I think one of the things that's really helped the mango market in New Zealand, like in the years that I've been in the New Zealand produce industry, the market has on mangoes grown exponentially. And I think some of that comes down to the consistency that mangoes are available in New Zealand. We are essentially 12 months of the year now. So being able to have that consistency for especially those products where it's not seasonal is really important.
Where the mangoes coming from at the moment, Jade, into New Zealand?
Probably the four big ones are Ecuador, Peru, Australia, and Mexico. So there's three out of the Americas and the Australia. And the interesting thing about mangoes is consumers there's a range of consumers for it. So you think the South American mangoes in New Zealand are very much a commodity product. Like you can buy them from $1.90 or $1.49 to about $2.99. The Australian mangoes, much bigger, sweeter, softer melting flesh, like the Artuita or the KP are the two main varieties there. They command retail prices of around $6 to $7 each. So it really comes down to the attributes of the mango. There are a small amount of mangoes currently imported from Fiji, and Thailand and India have also dabbled in the market. But I know when I went through this list that mangoes are a commodity that a lot of the Pacific countries have a import health standard and access to New Zealand for. It's just it's not well utilised.
The mangoes that you mentioned from your importing countries, goodness, that's a long ways away, right? So I just can't help but think about the freight and the logistics costs involved in those commodities coming from so far away, and the opportunities that the Pacific Island countries perhaps could give some consideration to, like you said, closer market to New Zealand. There was a question around market sampling. Does MG marketing get into that area of helping or assisting or taking on market? The word just escapes me. Promotion for new produce coming into the market.
It's not something that it's not something that we normally get into. Are you talking about establishing for new market access?
Yes,
or
yes. Yeah,
it's not something that we've done a lot in, and it'd be the only reason really is that MPI have been working through updating the import health standards for a long period of time, and new market access, there hasn't been many products that the new market access has been given to.
Yeah,
I think if those with products that they want new market access can be patient. I know there's work going on currently that in the next 18 to 24 months may see the opportunities change where market access is opportunities for market access will improve. And I think working with talking to MPI first about wanting to bring the product in, and then we're happy to work. We do a lot of work already with MPI now, so we're happy to work with them to help.
Yeah. Say, for example, I was thinking more in terms of, so if there is a commodity already approved on a country's approved list,
yes.
Say, just take melons, for example. So watermelons from Tonga, absolutely wonderful, coming in, hitting the New Zealand shelves already. Other varieties of melons, say, for example, if another Pacific Island country were to come to you or us or some other agency and say, look, we've got a beautiful range of this species of melons, whether it's rock melons, for example, and they haven't entered the market as yet. If we came to MG marketing and said, hey, look, here's some samples of rock melons from, say, Tuvalu or Fiji or Samoa, would your company take that on board to say, okay, we'll test this in the market, we'll do some sample testing?
Oh, most definitely, provided there's an import pathway for it. Most definitely. Yes.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'm just looking through the questions again, Jade. I don't think there's any more we can throw your way. Vanilla, is there is vanilla on your list? Sorry, not on your list.
Unfortunately not, no.
Yeah.
No.
There's a question that came through about vanilla. We have a few vanilla producing countries in the Pacific. But anyway, look, Jade, thank you very, very much for your time this morning. Absolutely. We're just so fortunate to have someone of your caliber and representing MG Marketing. Some very, very useful information you've shared with us, and I'm sure those online will agree that for many of them, I'm sure this is the first time they've heard a lot of your messages. So thank you. We will
No problem. Thank you.
circulate your PowerPoint presentation and your email contact to all of those online yesterday and today, if that's okay with you, and direct any other questions that come through to you, if that's all right.
Good as gold. Thank you very much.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very, very much, Jade. Thank you.